Imagine standing on a ridge in what is now eastern Washington, more than 15,000 years ago, and hearing a sound that has no comparison in the modern world. Not thunder, not an earthquake, something larger than both. Within hours, a wall of water taller than a 20-story building would tear across the landscape at speeds approaching 60 miles per hour, carrying icebergs the size of houses, grinding boulders into dust and stripping away soil that had taken thousands of years to form. This was not a flood in the way we normally use the word. It was closer to an ocean unleashed all at once, moving with the force of 100 rivers combined. Geologists call this event the Missoula Floods, and it did not happen just once. It happened again, and again, possibly dozens of times, as an immense glacial lake in what is now western Montana repeatedly broke free from an ice dam, holding it back, releasing more water than exists in all of Lake Erie and Lake Ontario combined, sometimes in a matter of days. Each time the dam gave way, that water raced across Idaho, Washington, and Oregon, carving canyons into solid basalt rock, stripping away topsoil down to bare stone, and leaving behind a landscape so strange that scientists would later give it its own name, the channeled scablands. Today, satellites orbiting far above the Earth can still see the scars. Massive dry waterfalls, some larger than Niagara, sit in the middle of desert land with no river anywhere near them. Ripple marks the size of city blocks stretch across valley floors, the kind of ripples you'd expect to see in a stream, except each one is 50 feet tall. For a long time, no one could explain what had made them. But the land was not empty when this happened. People were living across this region when those floodwaters came, and long before any geologist stood on a scarred ridge and wondered what had carved it, the tribes of the Pacific Northwest already had an answer. They had been telling it for generations, stories of a rising water that swallowed valleys whole, stories of families climbing to high ground and watching the world below disappear. Stories passed from elder to child, repeated so many times that the details never changed, even as centuries passed and languages shifted around them. For most of the 20th century, those stories were treated as folklore. Beautiful, perhaps. Meaningful, perhaps. But not history. Because how could anyone remember something that happened over 15,000 years ago? Human memory does not work that way. Or so it was assumed. This is the story of what happens when a scientific mystery and an oral tradition, kept apart for nearly a century, are finally placed side by side, and what happens when the evidence beneath the ground and the evidence carried in memory begin, almost impossibly to agree. In the early 1920s, a geologist named J. Harlan Bretz began mapping the strange terrain of eastern Washington. What he found troubled him: canyons with no rivers, waterfalls with no water, massive gravel bars stacked in patterns that looked as though they had been placed by a force beyond anything in recorded geology. Bretz proposed something that, at the time, sounded almost like science fiction. He suggested that a catastrophic flood, larger than anything in human experience, had swept across the region in a matter of days, reshaping hundreds of miles of land almost instantly. The scientific community rejected the idea outright. Geology in the early 20th century was built on a foundational principle called uniformitarianism, the idea that the Earth's surface is shaped slowly, gradually, over immense stretches of time. Rivers carve canyons over millions of years. Glaciers grind valleys over tens of thousands. Nothing, the thinking went, happens suddenly. Nothing catastrophic. Nothing fast. Bretz was proposing the opposite. A landscape reshaped not over eons, but over a single terrifying week. For decades, his colleagues dismissed him. Some openly mocked him at geological conferences. His theory of a sudden, violent flood was treated as an embarrassment to the field, a return to outdated ideas of biblical-scale catastrophe dressed up in modern language. It would take more than 40 years, and the discovery of the actual glacial lake that had caused it, Glacial Lake Missoula, before the scientific establishment finally admitted that Bretz had been right all along. In 1979, at the age of 96, Bretz received the Penrose Medal, the highest honor in American geology, for a theory his peers had ridiculed for most of his working life. When told of the honor, he is said to have remarked that he had simply outlived his critics. It is a remarkable story on its own, A single scientist correct about a catastrophe of almost unimaginable scale, dismissed for decades simply because what he described didn't fit the accepted timeline of how the Earth was supposed to change. But there is a second half to this story, one that took even longer to surface. Because while Bretz's colleagues spent 40 years refusing to believe that the land itself could preserve evidence of a sudden catastrophe, they never once considered that people might have preserved that same evidence too. Not in rock, not in sediment layers, but in language passed from one generation to the next, exactly the way oral tradition is meant to survive. The tribes of the region did not need satellite imagery to know something extraordinary had happened here. They had never stopped saying so. Across the Pacific Northwest, tribal nations, including the Nez Perce, the Spokane, the Yakima, and others maintained oral traditions, describing a great and sudden flood, one that rose without warning and swallowed the valleys where people lived. These were not vague references to rain or seasonal rivers overflowing. The details were specific. Water rising with terrifying speed, entire communities forced to flee to high ground within hours. A landscape transformed so completely afterward that survivors barely recognized the valleys they had once called home. For much of the 20th century, anthropologists who documented these stories treated them the way they treated most oral traditions from indigenous cultures, as mythology. Meaningful, within its cultural context, perhaps poetic, but not something to be cross-referenced with geological data. There is a reason for that dismissal, and it says more about the assumptions of Western science than it does about the traditions themselves. Oral history was, for a long time, considered inherently unreliable as a historical record. The thinking went that stories change as they are retold, that details are exaggerated, softened, or lost entirely across generations, and that anything passed down for thousands of years without written record could not possibly preserve accurate information about a real event. And yet the flood traditions of the Pacific Northwest did not describe a vague apocalypse. They described something remarkably close to what geologists would eventually reconstruct from the rock itself. Water arriving suddenly, moving with unnatural speed, and reshaping the land in a way that could never fully be undone. Could two entirely different kinds of evidence, one carved into basalt and one carried inside language, be describing the same event? For decades, few researchers were willing to ask that question seriously. The gap between the estimated end of the last Missoula flood, roughly 13 to 15,000 years ago, and the assumed arrival of the first humans in North America was, according to mainstream models at the time, far too wide to bridge. Mainstream archaeology for most of the 20th century held firmly to what is known as the Clovis First model, the idea that the earliest humans arrived in North America no more than about 13,000 years ago, crossing a land bridge from Siberia and spreading southward afterward. If that model was correct, no human beings could have witnessed the Missoula Floods at all. The timeline simply didn't allow for it, which meant, according to the accepted framework, that the tribal flood stories could not possibly be describing this event. They had to be something else. A folk memory of ordinary regional flooding perhaps, dressed in the exaggerated language of oral tradition, passed down through countless retellings. That was the explanation offered for decades. Then the ground itself, once again, offered something the models had not accounted for. In 2021, researchers working at White Sands National Park in New Mexico published findings that would upend one of the oldest assumptions in North American archaeology. Preserved in ancient lake bed sediment, they had found human footprints, ordinary, unmistakable footprints left by people walking across soft mud thousands of years ago. Using radiocarbon dating on seed layers embedded above and below the footprints, the research team determined an age of over 20,000 years old. 20,000 years, not 13, not the safely conservative number that had defined mainstream thinking for the better part of a century. The implications were immediate and enormous. If people were walking across New Mexico more than 20,000 years ago, then human beings had almost certainly been present across North America for thousands of years before the Missoula Floods ever began. The timeline that had once made the tribal flood stories seem impossible no longer applied. Suddenly, the question was not whether people could have witnessed the floods. It was why anyone had ever assumed they hadn't. For nearly 100 years, Two separate bodies of evidence had existed side by side without being taken seriously together. Geologists spent decades proving that a catastrophe of almost unimaginable scale had reshaped the Pacific Northwest in a matter of days. Indigenous communities spent that same century and centuries before it, maintaining detailed oral accounts of a sudden overwhelming flood in that exact region. Neither side needed the other to know they were right, but only now does it become possible to ask whether they had, all along, been describing the very same night. None of this proves with total certainty that any single flood story can be traced to any single flood event 15,000 years ago. Oral tradition does not work like a court transcript preserved word for word across 600 generations. Details shift, meanings deepen. Stories absorb new context as they are retold, but that is not the same as saying the stories are inventions. What the White Sands discovery revealed is something far more important than a single date. It revealed that mainstream science had for most of a century drawn a hard boundary around what was possible, and had used that boundary to dismiss evidence that didn't fit inside it, not because the evidence was weak, but because the timeline used to judge it was wrong. The tribes of the Pacific Northwest never needed radiocarbon dating to know their histories were real. They had never treated their flood traditions as legend in the first place. That framing was applied from the outside, by researchers working from an incomplete map of the past. Perhaps that is the deeper story here, not simply a flood, however catastrophic, and not simply a set of footprints in New Mexico, but a reminder that recorded memory can outlast recorded science, that a story kept faithfully across thousands of years can hold its truth long before instruments exist to confirm it. The Missoula Floods reshaped an entire region in a matter of days, then faded into silence for thousands of years, waiting for geologists to notice the scars. The tribes who lived through it never needed to wait. They had been telling the truth the entire time. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy documentaries that explore forgotten history through geology, archaeology, indigenous tradition, and the moments where science finally catches up to memory, consider subscribing for more investigations like this. And before you go, I'd like to hear your thoughts. Do you think oral traditions like these deserve to be treated as historical evidence in their own right? Or should they remain separate from scientific inquiry? Let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll see you in the next documentary.